Depending on your perspective, it was either shock and horror or shock and awe of the surprise results of the Brexit referendum. All the polls seem to suggest the Remains would win. We ask if you still trust the polls. This is the Moneymakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. I'm joined by Director and Political Analyst at Ipsos, Mari Harris. Ipsos has been one of the leading political pollsters of South Africa's upcoming municipal elections. Mari Harris, how do we ever trust the pollsters again? They said it would be 52-48. But they said it would be 52-48 in favour of Remain, not Leave. You guys got it wrong. I talk you guys as the broad polling industry. How does it go so wrong?
Well, it is actually quite interesting, this whole issue of Brexit and the polls, because they basically do their polls in the UK in either one of two ways, either internet polls or phone polls. And to a large degree, the internet polls were closer than the phone polls. Obviously, with the high incidence of internet in the country, they can do internet polls, something we cannot do. But their phone polls had an inbuilt bias towards people who are slightly more educated. And as we know, those people were more likely to vote Remain than Exit. What is interesting is that in the last week there was a swing towards leaving the EU in the polls, that they did pick it up, but not as big as what it was in the end. And also there was throughout this process between 13 and 20%, so up to 1 in every 5 who said they don't know and they might change their opinion when they get to the polling booths. So in the end it is very difficult to predict anything if it's this close. You need something closer to the gold standard of doing polling, which is face-to-face, in-home interviews. But as we know, South Africa is one of the few countries where we still do that. In most of the other big democracies, they do either internet or phone polls only.
I mean, I would think that the face-to-face interview, the in-home interview is not only time-consuming but incredibly costly versus the slightly easier, low-budget version of popping a phone call to somebody or asking their opinions via an email. That
is very true. Face-to-face interviewing is a lot more costly, but that's a lot more accurate as well. Unless when you have a universe that is completely either enabled by phone or completely enabled by internet, then you can get very, very close. I do think something that people forget is that polling is not an exact science. There's a lot of things that can influence it: the size of your sample, the way that you did your sampling, the way you asked your questions, the proportion of people who are uncertain, as well as the timing when you did it. Obviously, any poll done closer to the election, or in this case the referendum, would be closer to the truth or the ultimate result.
Now, I mean, this I want to talk about some local South African polling in just a second, but the huge media expectation of polling and this almost religious belief in polling, because people are looking for answers before the answers are available, does it put the industry, the polling industry, in some kind of crisis?
I don't think it's a crisis. I think it is a huge challenge, because in a lot of countries it is very difficult to get there. And I also think that pollsters need to be honest. If you don't know, you don't know. And if it's too close to call, I think media should also accept that. If you say it is too close to call, it can be either this or this. But in the end, as you say, people want answers before the answers are ready. So in a lot of cases, there's a huge pressure on the pollsters to produce these results that are not always available to produce in such a short space of time.
Now, let's talk about South Africa. Let's talk about the measures you're taking ahead of what could be, and certainly the polls suggest, that some municipalities in South Africa on the 3rd of August are going to be more tightly contested than at any other time in our democracy. Is that a fair comment to make?
Yes, we are doing 2 types of polling at the moment. We have a huge study in the field where we do almost 4,000 interviews all over the country. The sampling error on that is 1.63, so it's a very small sampling error. that we need to keep in mind for that particular poll. We do it all in all types of settlements, even in deep rural areas, and we ask a lot of questions, but we also ask people who they would vote for. The other type of polling we do specifically for ENCA, there because the incidence of phones is so high in the metro areas, and especially in Johannesburg, Tshwane and the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, we have recruited a panel of people that we call back every week and probe their views. I think a mistake a lot of media make and a lot of analysts make is that they only look at the so-called horse race question, who will win. But there's always so much more in the polls, because it explains why people do certain things. It explains a lot about how people think and feel and their thought processes. Therefore, these ENCA polls are specifically interesting because we can see how things change in the 7 weeks before the election that we are doing these polls. And already, I think a lot of interesting things have come to light. As at the moment, I would say the polls are too close to call in all those metros. Because, no, not for this or that reason, but 1 in every 5 people say they don't know who they would vote for. I cannot make up their minds. They need to make up their own minds. And, well, if they want to, they will tell us in the end who they want to vote for or who they're likely to vote for. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind when you do polling is whether people are registered or not. In the polls that we do face-to-face, and by the way, in the homes and in the home languages of people, we ask them whether we can see either their ID cards or their green ID books. So there is a verification that they are indeed registered to vote, because that's a huge thing. There's about 10 million people who are eligible to vote in this country who are not registered to vote. And if you ask the universe, the total population, in other words, everybody that's eligible to vote, who they're going to vote for, you get very different results from when you only look at those who are registered to vote.
Murray, explain to me, please, the science behind this. How do you take a nation of between 50 and 60 million people? You choose a sample of 4,000, and you do come with astonishing accuracy based on the relatively small sample that you take with results towards an outcome. How does the scientific process of polling work on such a relatively small sample?
Okay. It is really a process of stratification. You first of all look at the total population, the universe. There's about 36 million people who are 18 years and older, a little bit less than that. Then you stratify per province. Within the province, you look at the different types of settlements, metro areas, cities, large towns, small towns, villages, rural. You do a process that you call accumulation. You choose your sampling points. And you know, okay, fine, in the metros I need, for argument's sake, 6 sampling points. Then you go to your maps, and in your metro area you do a similar process of accumulation, choosing the sample points to be distributed across that metro area, and you send your interviewers to the points that you have chosen. They usually need to do either 4 or 6 interviews close to that point. There's certain instructions. You always walk, well, it goes in a lot of detail, but let me just explain. On the left side of the road, you choose the house with the lowest number, for argument's sake, ending in a 3. You list all we go into the house. You ask the people whether you can talk to them. You list all the people in that household who are eligible to vote. Then you choose one to speak to. You need to go back 3 times to the same house to be able to speak to that person. You make appointments sometimes. If it's not possible, even after the 3 calls, you go to the house opposite the street or to the house next door on the one side, then next door on the other side. You skip 5 houses, then it's your next sampling point. So it's quite an intricate process. In South Africa, obviously, in a lot of cases, there's more than 1 household on a plot or a stand. In that case, we choose one of the households, again randomly, and then go into that household and go through the whole process. In the rural areas, it's slightly different. The households are defined differently. The definitions that we use for a household are all people who cook together, who eat together. So in a lot of instances, you get, for instance, in a house, there might be 3 households living in the one house. Then we would count them as 3 households and choose one of them. So it is a long process. It is a fairly complicated process. Interviewers are specifically trained to do random sampling. If they're not trained to do random sampling, they never left to do it on their own. An interviewer who has more experience goes with them the first few times that they do it, and then you interview the people. So yeah, it takes a long time to do personal in-home interviewing.
Okay, so when are we going to be able to get reliable data from Ipsos as to what is likely to happen on the 3rd of August in South Africa, particularly in those too close to call metros that you mentioned earlier, Tshwane being one, City of Joburg perhaps another, and certainly Nelson Mandela Bay, which is probably the most hotly contested of the metropoles this time round?
Yes, definitely. The week before the elections, we planned our last big poll to come out of field as close as possible to the election, because then we know we would also be as close as possible to the final result. So yeah, the week before the election will probably go public.
What does the research say, though, about the impact that polling has on election outcomes? If I see an outcome that I kind of agree with in my metropole, I may choose to stay away. Or if I see one with which I disagree, or one that frightens me, I may choose then to actually go and vote. And many others may do the same.
It is possible. However, all the studies done shows that polls is one of the sources that people use for information. They also obviously consult the media, they speak to their friends, and to be honest, friends and family have the biggest influence, not polls, not politicians, not the media. It's all different sources of information that people use. And I think polls is probably a lot of people overestimate the role that polls play. It is really just one of the sources of information that people can use. And then let's not forget that a lot of people in our country specifically do not have access to all the types of media. They do not read newspapers, they do not necessarily watch television or not news programs on television. So they do not have access to the polls and poll results or to media reports.
There we go. Mari Harris, really interesting insight into the world of polling and how polling works and the impact it could or could not have on the South African municipal elections on the 3rd of August. Mari Harris is Director and Political Analyst at Ipsos Public Affairs. More issues to do with voting, more issues to do with your money next time on the Moneymakers. Thanks for watching. Good night.